In this episode, I'm going to discuss with you how much exercise and training you can safely perform if you have a current injury. And I'm also going to give you my 3 recommendations and 3 tips about how you should structure your training regime to ensure that you're not continuously aggravating that injury. Hey everyone, it's Mark here from Rehab WOD and CrossFit Essendon, where I help recreational CrossFit and functional fitness athletes overcome knee and shoulder pain. If you're new here, then be sure to check us out on Instagram or Facebook by searching for Rehab WOD. Otherwise, you can find all the links in the description below. So regarding injuries in CrossFit F45 strength training, contrary to what most people might think, is that musculoskeletal injuries and overuse injuries are not actually that high in these areas. If you were to compare to something like AFL, soccer, swimming, basketball, there are actually much higher rates of soft tissue and musculoskeletal injuries in these sports as opposed to things like CrossFit and F45. We do know that these injuries do still occur in these sports. The most common areas to become injured have been shown to be the knee, the shoulder, as well as the lower back. If you stick around towards the end of this episode, I'm also going to give you access to my free mobility assessment video, which you can perform at home. It's a really quick and simple test, a functional screening test to see where your mobility restrictions lie and which areas of your body may be contributing to your current injury. So let's get into today's episode, into the tips. So we're going to go through 3 tips on what you should be focusing on, what you should be implementing into your training if you currently have an injury that you're trying to manage or rehabilitate. So tip number 1 is to work at a safe and tolerable workload. So in my opinion, this is the most important tip to consider when you're trying to rehab an injury. Without this being implemented into your training, then all the other parts would fall apart, and you're probably not going to get an effective program as it relates to your injury. First of all, we have to define what a workload is. So what is a workload? Workload is basically the total amount of volume or work that you perform in a given session or in a given week. So we can multiply and we can calculate workload or volume by basically multiplying the sets times the reps times the amount of weight on the bar. So for example, if you're doing a bench press and you've done 3 sets of 10 at 50 kilos, we can do 3 times 10 times 50, and that gives us our volume or our workload for that given session. From there, we can then equate our volume or our workload for the entire week. So we can equate the volume from a Monday session and a Thursday session as it relates to the bench press, and we can give a total weekly volume. So one of the most important things to consider is that when you have an injury is to work at a safe and tolerable workload which your injury can sustain without it flaring up. So for example, if we have shoulder pain and you are 3 months into an injury, you've had shoulder pain for about 3 months, and you find that doing a push press at 3 sets of 10 at about 35 kilos just flares up your shoulder pain. It just makes it significantly worse after your session, but you find that working at 3 sets at 6 reps at 25 kilos feels a lot better during the set, and you do not get any flare-ups of your injury after that session. That would be a safe, tolerable workload for you to work at, as opposed to working at a workload and intensity which your injury cannot sustain. So first and foremost, when training with an injury, is that you need to choose weights and movements which you can tolerate without your pain getting worse. So this comes down to knowing your limits, to knowing which movements you can do safely and effectively without your pain flaring up, and it comes down to knowing your body really well so that you can apply that strategy to your training. This might seem like a pretty obvious tip, what I'm saying here, but it is often an area which is overlooked when people are trying to rehabilitate an injury. They just think that if they rest an injury, or if they rest their shoulder pain, for example, and then they try and go back into a high intensity or a high workload a few weeks later, that they can get away with it. It's most often not the case. It's really important to choose workloads which you know that you can do without your injury flaring up first before progressing forward from there. Tip number 2 comes down to the frequency of training of the injured area. So regarding frequency, what frequency is? Frequency is the amount of training sessions that you do in a given week. Now, from there, we can then separate our training frequency into how many times you would train a given body part per week. So for example, if you separate your training session into, say, Monday, you do an upper body push and a lower body push, and then Tuesday you do a lower body pull and an upper body pull, and then you repeat that on a Thursday and Friday, that would mean that you're training a lower body push and an upper body push 2 times a week, and that would be your frequency for those movements. Concurrently, we can also separate the frequency as to how many times or how frequently we load the injured area per week. So for example, if you have a shoulder injury, if you do push-ups on a Monday, bench press on a Wednesday, and you do push press on a Friday, that would mean that you're loading the injured area 3 times per week. The most important thing to consider when thinking about frequency is to control the frequency of which you load the injured tissue. In my recommendation, if you're training with an injury, you should only properly load that area no more than 2 times per week. So this would be in a given training session, which is a bit more intense and which has a bit more volume. For example, if you have shoulder pain and you do bench press at a safe and tolerable workload on a Monday, and that feels fine, there's been no increase in your pain, I would recommend that you don't train an upper body pushing motion until a Thursday or a Friday. That way you're giving your body enough time to rest, you're giving your body at least 2 or 3 days to recover, and that way you can control how much volume and how much workload you're placing through that injured area. As opposed to if you're loading the shoulder on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that might be just too much workload and stimulus for that injured area, and that would result in an aggravation of your pain. So for this point, making sure that you're having really good breaks in between the time period when you're loading the injured area. Make sure that you're not heavily loading the area no more than 2 times per week. The third type basically relates to the type and speed and intensity of the movements performed. So what I've done is I've broken up this section into 3 main parts, because all of these 3 parts relate to the type, the speed and intensity of the movements that you're performing. So often when we have an injury, we most often want to get back to all the hard, fast and intense stuff which is involved in training. So if you're doing CrossFit, you most likely want to get back to, say, doing things like box jumps, Olympic lifting, split jerks, overhead squats, all those really fast and intense stuff which can really improve our fitness. However, it is often these movements which are a bit more complex and which are a bit faster technically, which are movements which can potentially flare up our injury. So I've separated this area into 3 main parts as to how you should or could go about altering your training regime. The first is to use less ballistic or fast movements. So for example, if you have knee pain and you're performing a lot of things like squat jumps, jumping lunges, box jumps, running, they might just be a bit too fast or a bit too ballistic for your knee to handle. So they might be movements that you do a lot later in your rehab process, because as we know, those fast and ballistic movements such as skipping, running, jumping, jump lunges can potentially flare up your knee pain in this case. Next is to perform movements which have no disconnect from the ground. So a disconnection is any movement where your feet leave the ground and then they have to land on the ground again in a fast manner. So a really good example would be if you're doing Olympic lifting, such as a squat clean, and your feet have to leave the ground for a short period and then reclaim a position really quickly. That would be a disconnection from the ground in which you have to reclaim your position on the ground really quickly. When performing these movements, you are more prone to becoming injured or flaring up your injury, because these movements just require more speed and more technique. So if you have knee pain in this example, you might decide to back off on those movements which have that disconnection from the ground. And a really good variation to do is to do things like muscle cleans or a hang muscle clean or a hang power clean, because these movements require less technique, and they also mean that you don't have to perform that disconnection from the ground. That would mean that you can keep your feet on the ground the whole time, because a muscle clean requires you to keep your feet in contact with the ground for the entire rep. And then C, so the third part of this recommendation number 3 is to perform movements at a slower pace and with tempo. So we know that the faster you do a movement, the more easy it is for your technique to break down. So if you're doing things like squats, overhead pressing, bench press, and you decide to lighten the load because that is the load that you can tolerate for your injury, then what you might do is also slow down the speed and the tempo of those reps to make sure that it's a lot more slow and controlled, and that you can control the technique. For example, if you're doing squats, then you might decide to do a 3-second eccentric tempo on the way down. So as you lower your hips down to the bottom, you might take that really slow and only make that a 3-second contraction, as opposed to going really fast on the way up and on the way down. This is really great to control the speed and the tempo of the movement, which can help improve and control your pain. Finally, with all these, we've spoken about monitoring the workload, monitoring the frequency, and to make sure that you're altering and monitoring the type and speed of the movement. But fundamentally, what is really important in overcoming your injury is to make sure that you have a well-structured and progressive rehab program to go along with it. There's no point in doing all these steps and trying to work around your injury for months and months if you're not looking to improve your pain for the long term by doing a progressive rehab program. So if you have knee pain, really working on good motor control and endurance and strength surrounding your knee. So that would be working on areas with your quadriceps, with your glutes, and with your hamstrings. This is going to go a long way in trying to improve your pain, as opposed to just trying to work around it for the long term. So I'm curious to know, out of all these 3 recommendations which I've spoken about today, which is the one which you're going to implement into your own training? Is it altering the workload, altering the frequency, or altering the type and speed of the movement? Comment below which one you will most likely implement into your training. I'm interested to know which one you will perform. Otherwise, if you want to get access to my free mobility guide video to see where you might be restricted and which areas might be contributing to your pain, then there'll be a link in the description below which you can click on and which you can get access to. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're taking care of those injuries, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.